Dr. Valeria Chen had once stood at the pinnacle of scientific achievement. At 35, she was the youngest professor in the biomedical engineering department at Stanford University. Her research laboratory buzzed with activity, filled with graduate students and postdocs eager to work under her guidance. The walls were lined with awards, published papers, and photographs of her shaking hands with Nobel laureates. That was 13 years ago. Now, at 48, Valeria sat in a small staff room at Sunshine Daycare Center, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug and reviewing the day's activities for her group of 4-year-olds. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with what seemed like the greatest achievement of her career, the development of a revolutionary gene therapy technique that could potentially cure certain types of childhood leukemia. The research had consumed 5 years of her life, countless sleepless nights, and every ounce of her scientific passion. Dr. Marcus Wolf, her longtime research partner and someone she had trusted implicitly, had worked alongside her throughout the project. They had been friends since graduate school, their careers intertwined through collaboration and mutual respect. When the breakthrough came, Valeria felt they were on the verge of changing medical history. But Marcus had other plans. 3 weeks before their scheduled presentation to the National Institute of Health, Marcus accused Valeria of falsifying data. He presented what appeared to be evidence of manipulated test results, suggesting that she had been under pressure to produce results and had taken unethical shortcuts. The accusation was devastating, not just professionally, but personally. The investigation that followed was thorough and brutal. Although no concrete evidence of wrongdoing was found, the shadow of doubt was enough. Academic reputations are fragile things, built over decades but destroyed in moments. The university, afraid of scandal, quietly suggested Valeria take a leave of absence. The NIH withdrew funding. Her research team disbanded. Graduate students transferred to other labs. Marcus, meanwhile, continued the research using her foundational work. 6 months later, he published the breakthrough findings under his name alone. The therapy was hailed as revolutionary. Marcus received international recognition, speaking engagements, and eventually a position as department head. Valeria fought the accusations for 2 years, hiring lawyers she couldn't afford, appealing to colleagues who no longer returned her calls. The stress destroyed her marriage. Her husband, also an academic, couldn't handle the professional embarrassment and filed for divorce. They had no children, which in retrospect felt like a mercy. By the time the legal battles ended, Valeria was emotionally and financially exhausted. The scientific community had moved on, her name associated with controversy rather than innovation. Job applications to universities were met with polite rejections. Research positions were suddenly filled before she could interview. She found herself in the strange position of being overqualified for everything she could get and underqualified for everything she wanted. The job at Sunshine Daycare had been meant as a temporary solution, a way to pay rent while she figured out her next move. That was 3 years ago. During those dark first months after the collapse of her career, Valeria had struggled with a depression so deep it frightened her. She would wake up in her small apartment, look at the boxes of research materials she couldn't bear to unpack, and wonder what the point of getting out of bed was. The woman who had once given lectures to hundreds of students now found it difficult to have a simple conversation with a cashier at the grocery store. Her sister Maria, a high school counselor in Sacramento, had been the one to suggest the daycare job. "You need to be around people again," Maria had said during one of their weekly phone calls. "Children don't care about your past. They just need someone who will care about them." At first, Valeria had resisted the idea. She was a scientist, not a babysitter. But as her savings dwindled and her isolation deepened, she realized she had few options left. The interview at Sunshine Daycare had been awkward. Mrs. Rodriguez, the head teacher at the time, had clearly been puzzled by an applicant with a PhD applying for an assistant position. "Why do you want to work with children?" Mrs. Rodriguez had asked. Valeria had struggled to answer honestly. "Because I need to remember what it feels like to make a positive difference in someone's life," Valeria discovered that working with children required a different kind of intelligence than scientific research, but it was no less demanding. 4-year-olds were unpredictable variables in an experiment she couldn't control. They had emotional needs that couldn't be solved with equations, social dynamics that shifted like chemical reactions, and an energy that rivaled any laboratory equipment she had ever operated. At first, she approached the job with the same methodical precision she had once applied to her research. She created detailed lesson plans, organized activities with scientific efficiency, and tried to maintain order through systematic approaches. The head teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, gently suggested she relax a little. "Children aren't hypotheses to be tested," Mrs. Rodriguez had said with a kind smile. "They're little humans trying to make sense of the world. Sometimes the best thing you can do is help them explore and wonder." Gradually, Valeria began to see the wisdom in this approach. She started incorporating simple science experiments into playtime, showing the children how baking soda and vinegar created fizzy reactions, how plants grew toward light, how magnets attracted metal objects. Their wonder and excitement reminded her of why she had fallen in love with science in the first place. The children, oblivious to her past academic credentials, accepted her completely. To them, she was simply Miss Valeria, who made the best Play-Doh, read stories with different voices for each character, and always remembered which child was allergic to what. They didn't care about published papers or research grants. They cared that she listened when they talked about their pet hamsters and helped them tie their shoes. One particularly difficult day during her first year, when the weight of her lost career felt especially heavy, a little girl named Lucy had approached her during afternoon snack time. Lucy was one of the quieter children, often overlooked in the chaos of a busy classroom. "Miss Valeria," Lucy had said, tugging on her sleeve, "you look sad today." Valeria had been startled by the child's perceptiveness. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just thinking about some grown-up things." Lucy had considered this seriously, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a small stuffed elephant. "Mr. Peanuts helps me when I'm sad. You can borrow him today." The simple gesture had brought tears to Valeria's eyes. Here was this 4-year-old offering her most precious possession to comfort an adult she barely knew. It was a level of pure empathy and generosity that reminded Valeria of the fundamental goodness in the world. There were moments when her old life felt like a dream she had once had. Standing in the playground, watching children discover that shadows change throughout the day, she sometimes forgot about the laboratory, the betrayal, the professional humiliation. In those moments, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. But the pain never fully disappeared. Late at night, she would search online for news about Marcus's continued success. His therapy had moved to human trials with promising results. He had received a prestigious award from the World Health Organization. He was being considered for a Nobel Prize. Each achievement should have been shared with her, each recognition a reminder of what had been stolen. The hardest part wasn't the loss of prestige or money, though both had been significant. The hardest part was the loss of identity. For 35 years, she had been Dr. Valeria Chen, scientist, researcher, professor. Now she was just Valeria, daycare assistant, a footnote in someone else's success story. She had also lost touch with most of her former colleagues. The academic world was small and insular, and her public disgrace had made her a pariah. Invitations to conferences stopped coming. Research collaborations evaporated. Even friends from graduate school seemed uncomfortable maintaining contact, as if her professional failure might be contagious. The loneliness was sometimes overwhelming. Valeria had built her entire adult life around her career, and when that was taken away, she discovered how little else she had. No children to ground her, no hobbies to sustain her, no community outside of academia to support her. The divorce had been finalized just as she started working at the daycare, leaving her completely alone for the first time in her adult life. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, The children began to heal something in her that she hadn't even realized was broken. Their uncomplicated affection, their genuine excitement about simple discoveries, their absolute trust in her abilities, all of it gradually rebuilt her sense of self-worth. She began to remember what it felt like to be needed, to make a difference, to matter to someone. Tuesday, October 15th, started like any other day at Sunshine Daycare. Valeria arrived at 7:30 to help with breakfast and morning activities. The children trickled in with their parents, some eager to start the day, others clinging to familiar adults before being gently coaxed into the classroom. Her group consisted of 16 four-year-olds, each with their own personality and needs. There was Emma, who loved to build elaborate structures with blocks and often forgot to eat lunch because she was so focused on her creations. Tommy had boundless energy and struggled to sit still during story time, but could identify more dinosaur species than most adults. Sophia was shy, but incredibly empathetic, always the first to comfort a crying classmate. Marcus, and it still stung when she heard that name, was the class comedian, always trying to make others laugh, sometimes inappropriately. The morning proceeded normally. They practiced writing letters, sang songs about the weather, and worked on a craft project involving autumn leaves. Valeria had developed a routine over the past 3 years, a rhythm that felt natural and comfortable. During circle time, she had introduced a new concept about changing seasons, using props and visual aids to help the children understand why leaves change color. Inside every green leaf, she explained, holding up examples they had collected during yesterday's nature walk, there are actually other colors waiting to show themselves. When the weather gets colder, the green color goes away, and we can see the yellow and red that were there all along. Little Marcus raised his hand. So the colors were hiding? Not hiding exactly, Valeria said, smiling at his curiosity. More like waiting for the right time to appear. Sometimes the most beautiful things about us take time to show. She hadn't realized the deeper meaning of her own words until she spoke them. Sometimes wisdom came through the mouths of teachers trying to explain the world to 4-year-olds. At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Rodriguez made an announcement that caused excitement to ripple through the room. Children, remember we have our special field trip today to the Natural History Museum. Miss Valeria will be coming with us, along with Mrs. Patterson, and Mrs. Kim Valeria had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The museum had a new interactive science exhibit designed for young children, with hands-on activities that would let them explore concepts like gravity, magnetism, and simple machines. She had volunteered to lead some of the educational components, excited to share her love of scientific discovery with the children. The preparation for the field trip had taken considerable planning. Permission slips had been collected and filed, emergency contact information verified, dietary restrictions noted, and first aid supplies packed. Mrs. Rodriguez had assigned buddy partners to ensure no child would wander off alone, and they had practiced walking in pairs and using museum voices for the past week. The children buzzed with anticipation as they gathered their jackets and backpacks. Several parents had volunteered to drive, but they had decided to take the school bus to make it feel like a real adventure. The museum was only 20 minutes away by bus, and they planned to spend 2 hours exploring before returning for lunch and nap time. As they boarded the yellow school bus, Valeria did a mental head count. 16 children, 3 adults, 1 bus driver, everyone accounted for. She settled into a seat near the back, surrounded by chattering 4-year-olds pointing excitedly at passing cars and buildings. "Miss Valeria," Emma said, pressing her face to the window, "do you think we'll see real dinosaur bones?" "I hope so," Valeria replied. "The museum has some amazing specimens. We might even see a T-Rex skeleton." The bus ride was filled with animated conversations about what they might see, questions about how dinosaurs lived, and elaborate theories about museum adventures. Valeria found herself caught up in their excitement, remembering her own childhood visits to science museums and the sense of wonder they had inspired. The bus pulled into the museum parking lot at 11:45. The Natural History Museum was an impressive building, 4 stories of red brick and limestone, with wide steps leading to massive oak doors. School groups were a common sight, and the museum staff was well prepared for young visitors. "Stay with your buddy," Mrs. Rodriguez reminded the children as they disembarked. They had paired up for the trip, each child responsible for staying close to their assigned partner. "Remember our museum voices, inside voices only." The museum lobby was spacious and echoing, with a large dinosaur skeleton dominating the center space. The children stared in awe, their excited whispers filling the air. A museum educator named Janet met them at the information desk, clipboard in hand and a warm smile on her face. "Welcome to the Natural History Museum," Janet said, crouching down to the children's level. "We have some amazing things to show you today. Are you ready for an adventure?" The children responded with enthusiastic cheers, quickly hushed by their teachers. Janet led them toward the elevator that would take them to the second floor, where the new children's science exhibit was located. As they crowded into the large elevator, Valeria felt a strange sense of anticipation. She hadn't been in a science-focused environment in years, not since leaving the university. Even a children's museum felt like returning to a familiar but distant world. During the elevator ride, she found herself studying the building's construction with the eye of an engineer. The museum was an older structure, probably built in the 1940s or 1950s, with the solid construction typical of that era, but potentially vulnerable to certain types of stress. It was a habit from her undergraduate engineering studies that she had never lost, automatically assessing the structural integrity of buildings she entered. The elevator doors opened to reveal the Discovery Zone, a bright, colorful space designed specifically for young learners. Interactive stations were arranged throughout the room, each focusing on a different scientific concept. There were pulleys and levers, water tables demonstrating flow and pressure, magnifying stations with various objects to examine, and a section dedicated to simple chemistry reactions. "We'll spend about an hour and a half here," Janet explained to the adults. "The children can move freely between stations, but please supervise them closely. Some of the activities involve small parts that shouldn't go in mouths." The children dispersed eagerly, drawn to different areas by curiosity and interest. Valeria found herself naturally gravitating toward the chemistry station, where children could mix safe, non-toxic substances to create color changes and small reactions. She began explaining to a small group how baking soda and citric acid created bubbles when mixed with water. "It's like a tiny volcano," she told them, watching their eyes widen as the mixture frothed and bubbled. "The two substances are having a chemical reaction, which means they're changing into something new." Tommy raised his hand. "Can we make a bigger volcano?" Valeria smiled. "This is the perfect size for inside the museum. But maybe we can do a bigger experiment back at school sometime." As she worked with the children, Valeria felt more alive than she had in months. The familiar excitement of sharing scientific knowledge, the joy of seeing young minds make connections, the satisfaction of answering curious questions. It all reminded her of why she had become a scientist in the first place. Not for the prestige or recognition, but for the pure pleasure of discovery and understanding. At the water table, Sophia was fascinated by how different objects floated or sank. "Why does this one go down but this one stays up?" she asked, comparing a wooden block to a metal coin. "That's a great question," Valeria said, kneeling beside her. "It has to do with something called density. Some things are heavier for their size than others. The wood is light for its size, so it floats. The metal is heavy for its size, so it sinks." She helped Sophia experiment with different objects, encouraging her to make predictions before testing them. This was real science education, fostering curiosity and critical thinking skills that would serve the child well beyond the museum visit. The morning was progressing beautifully. The children were engaged in learning. The museum environment was stimulating without being overwhelming. And Valeria felt more alive than she had in months. She was in her element, explaining scientific concepts in simple terms, encouraging curiosity and experimentation. At 12:45, they were scheduled to move to the dinosaur exhibit on the first floor before heading back to the daycare. Janet had just begun gathering the children when it happened. The first tremor was subtle, barely noticeable. A slight vibration that might have been a large truck passing outside. Valeria felt it first because she was standing near a table with delicate glassware, and she noticed the small containers beginning to rattle gently. Her engineering background made her more sensitive to structural movements than most people. During her undergraduate studies, she had taken courses in seismic engineering and learned to recognize the signs of building stress. This felt different from the minor vibrations that occasionally occurred in any large building. "Did you feel that?" she asked Mrs. Rodriguez, who was helping Emma with a puzzle at a nearby station. Before Mrs. Rodriguez could answer, the second tremor hit, stronger and more sustained. Now everyone felt it. The building swayed slightly, and the overhead lights began to sway on their chains. Some of the children looked around in confusion, while others began to look frightened. "Everyone stay calm," Mrs. Rodriguez called out, her voice steady but alert. She had lived in California long enough to recognize an earthquake, but this felt different from the minor tremors they occasionally experienced. The third tremor was unmistakably powerful. The entire building shook violently, causing displays to topple and glass to shatter. The lights flickered and went out, leaving them in semi-darkness illuminated only by emergency lighting. Children began to cry, their voices echoing in the large space. "Earthquake!" Janet shouted, abandoning any pretense of calm. "Everyone get under the tables. Now!" This was the moment when Valeria's scientific training took over. While others might panic or freeze, she had spent years dealing with emergencies in laboratory settings. Her mind immediately began assessing the situation: structural integrity, escape routes, immediate dangers, and resource management. The room had several large, sturdy tables designed for group activities. "Children, come to me," Valeria called out, her voice cutting through the chaos with authority and calm. "We're going to play a special game called Table Fort. Everyone find a table and get underneath it." Her tone was so confident and reassuring that the children responded instinctively. Even those who had been crying stopped and looked to her for guidance. She began quickly but gently gathering children and directing them to the nearest sturdy shelter. "Emma, Tommy, Sophia, under this table here. Hold hands and stay down low." She demonstrated by crouching down herself, showing them how to protect their heads with their arms. "This is just like the turtle game we play at school, remember?" The building continued to shake, and dust began falling from the ceiling. Valeria could hear the groaning of stressed metal and concrete, sounds that triggered her engineering knowledge. This was not a minor earthquake. This was a significant seismic event, and they were in a building that was showing signs of structural stress. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Patterson were gathering other children, following Valeria's lead in using calm, authoritative voices. Janet had activated her radio and was trying to contact museum security, but the device crackled with static. "The elevators will be shut down," Valeria called out to the other adults. "We'll need to use the stairs when this stops shaking." But as she spoke, a new sound joined the earthquake's rumble, the distinct crack of structural failure. Looking up, Valeria saw a hairline fracture appearing in the ceiling, running from one corner of the room toward the center. Her engineering training told her something that made her blood run cold. This building was not going to hold. She quickly calculated the forces at work. The building was older, probably not built to current seismic standards. The large, open exhibition spaces created structural weaknesses. The suspended ceiling systems were particularly vulnerable to seismic stress. If this earthquake continued much longer, they could face a partial collapse. The shaking intensified, and Valeria realized they were experiencing what seismologists call a rolling earthquake. Waves of seismic energy that could continue for several minutes. The crack in the ceiling was widening, and she could see dust and small pieces of plaster beginning to fall. "We need to move," she announced to the other adults, her voice cutting through the noise. "This room is not safe." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at her with confusion and fear. "But they always say to take cover during an earthquake, not to move around." Valeria's scientific mind was running calculations: building construction, stress loads, seismic forces, structural failure patterns. The knowledge she had gained during her engineering undergraduate studies, before she had specialized in biomedical applications, was suddenly critical. "That's true for most buildings," she said, speaking quickly but clearly. "But this building is showing signs of structural compromise. Look at that crack in the ceiling. If this keeps up, we could have a partial collapse." As if to prove her point, a section of acoustic tile fell from the ceiling and shattered on the floor near one of the science stations. The children screamed, and several began crying harder. "Listen to me," Valeria said, and something in her tone made everyone, adults and children alike, focus on her completely. It was the voice she had once used to command a research laboratory, to present findings to critical audiences, to lead a team of brilliant scientists toward a common goal. "We're going to leave this room safely and calmly. The stairs are our best option, but we need to move as a group. No one gets left behind, no one runs ahead. Mrs. Rodriguez, can you take the lead with 8 children? Mrs. Patterson, you take the middle group. I'll bring up the rear with the rest." She was making command decisions based on risk assessment and resource allocation, skills she had developed during years of managing complex research projects. The context was different, but the fundamental leadership principles were the same. Assess the situation, identify resources, assign responsibilities, execute the plan. In the laboratory, she had often faced crisis situations that required quick thinking and decisive action. Equipment failures, chemical spills, contamination incidents, all required the ability to stay calm under pressure and make rapid decisions based on incomplete information. Those experiences had taught her that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about making the best decisions possible with available information and inspiring confidence in others. "What about museum protocol?" Janet asked, her voice shaking. "I'm supposed to contact security, wait for instructions." "The building is compromising," Valeria said firmly. "We don't have time for protocol. We have 16 children whose safety is our responsibility." Another, more violent tremor shook the building, and this time the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie shadows throughout the room. The sound of breaking glass came from somewhere else in the building, along with what might have been screaming. Valeria's mind was working at maximum efficiency, processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. The earthquake was continuing longer than typical, suggesting a major seismic event. The building's structural response indicated vulnerabilities that could lead to catastrophic failure. The children's emotional state required careful management to prevent panic. The adults needed clear direction to function effectively. "Okay, children," Valeria called out, her voice somehow remaining calm and cheerful despite the circumstances. "We're going to take a special adventure walk through the museum. Remember our buddy system. Hold your partner's hand tight and stay close to your grown-up." She began organizing the children with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex operations under pressure. "Emma, you're with Sophia. Tommy, you're with Marcus. Everyone find your buddy and hold hands." The children, sensing the authority and calm in her voice, responded remarkably well. Their crying diminished to sniffles, and they began following her instructions. Children are remarkably adaptable, and they were taking their cues from the adults around them. "Mrs. Rodriguez, take Emma, Sophia, Tommy, Marcus, and the Johnson twins. Head toward the stairwell. It should be to the left when we exit this room. Move steadily, but don't rush. Mrs. Patterson, you have the Chen kids, little Bobby, Maria, and Ashley. I'll take the remaining 6 with Janet." As they prepared to move, Valeria did a quick mental inventory of supplies and potential needs. The diaper bag had basic first aid supplies. Janet had a flashlight on her keychain. Mrs. Patterson had bottled water for the children. They had the bare essentials for a short-term emergency. When we get to the stairwell, Valeria continued, we're going to go down slowly and carefully. Children on the inside, adults on the outside. If anyone falls, we stop and help them up. If anyone gets scared, we stop and take care of them. The earthquake was still continuing, though the intensity was fluctuating. Valeria estimated they had been experiencing tremors for nearly 3 minutes now, which suggested a major seismic event. Her mind was cataloging information: building age, construction type, occupancy load, egress routes. She found herself drawing on knowledge she hadn't used in years. During her undergraduate engineering studies, she had taken a course on structural dynamics that covered seismic response. The professor had emphasized that older buildings with large, open spaces were particularly vulnerable to certain types of earthquake motion. The suspended ceiling systems common in 1950s construction could become deadly projectiles during seismic events. "Are you sure about this?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked quietly. "Maybe we should wait for rescue personnel." Valeria looked at the crack in the ceiling, which had grown noticeably larger in the past few minutes. Chunks of plaster were now falling regularly, and she could hear the groaning of stressed structural members throughout the building. "If rescue personnel need to come find us under a collapsed ceiling, we haven't helped anyone. The safest place is outside this building." Chapter 6. The Evacuation. Moving 16 4-year-olds through a darkened, shaking building during an earthquake should have been chaos. Instead, Valeria's systematic approach and calm leadership created an organized evacuation that likely saved lives. They left the Discovery Zone in formation, with Mrs. Rodriguez leading the first group of children toward the stairwell. The hallways were dimly lit by emergency lighting, and the continuing tremors made walking challenging. But the children held hands and moved forward with remarkable cooperation. "We're explorers in a cave," Valeria told her group, turning the frightening experience into an adventure story. "We have to move carefully and stay together so nobody gets lost in the dark." The transformation of terror into adventure was a technique she had learned during her years working with the children at the daycare. 4-year-olds responded better to imaginative frameworks than abstract explanations. By giving them a story to inhabit, she provided them with a sense of purpose and control over their situation. The museum's emergency systems had activated, with recorded announcements telling visitors to remain calm and follow evacuation procedures. But Valeria noticed that other groups seemed to be waiting in place, following standard earthquake protocols that assumed buildings would remain structurally sound. As they reached the stairwell, she could see other museum visitors huddled in doorways and under tables throughout the building. A group of elderly tourists was clustered near the information desk, afraid to move during the continuing tremors. A family with teenagers was arguing about whether to stay or go. The stairwell felt more stable than the exhibition spaces, confirming Valeria's assessment that the building's core structure was sounder than the large, open areas with their suspended ceiling systems. The concrete and steel construction of the stair tower was designed to withstand seismic forces better than the exhibition halls. "Keep moving," Valeria told her group. The stairwell felt more stable than the open rooms, and she realized the core of the building was probably structurally sounder than the exhibition spaces, with their large, open areas and suspended ceilings. They began descending the stairs, children holding the railings with one hand and their buddy's hand with the other. Mrs. Rodriguez's group was ahead of them, moving steadily downward. Mrs. Patterson's group was in the middle, with Janet helping to keep everyone organized. "One step at a time," Valeria coached her group. "There's no hurry. We're safe in the stairwell." The children responded well to her calm direction. Even little Marcus, who normally had trouble following instructions, was focused and cooperative. The extraordinary circumstances seemed to bring out the best in all of them. That's when they heard it. A deep groaning sound from above, followed by a crash that echoed through the stairwell. Dust rained down from somewhere above them, and the children instinctively huddled closer to the adults. "What was that?" little Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. Just the building settling, Valeria said, though she suspected it was actually a partial ceiling collapse somewhere above them. We're safe in the stairwell. Keep going, explorers. Her calm demeanor was masking a growing concern. The building was definitely experiencing structural failure, and they needed to get everyone outside as quickly as possible. But panicking the children would only make the situation more dangerous. The sound they had heard was almost certainly the collapse of part of the Discovery Zone's suspended ceiling system. If they had followed standard protocols and remained under the tables, some of them might have been seriously injured or killed. Her decision to evacuate, controversial as it might be, was proving to be correct. As they reached the second-floor landing, they encountered other people in the stairwell. A museum security guard was trying to coordinate the evacuation of visitors from multiple floors, his radio crackling with confused reports from throughout the building. "Ma'am, you need to take shelter," the guard told Valeria. "We're implementing earthquake protocols. Everyone should remain in place until the shaking stops." "This building is compromising," Valeria said, using her most authoritative professional voice. "I have 16 children and we need to get outside immediately." The security guard looked uncertain. "I have my orders." Another crash from somewhere in the building, louder this time, punctuated her point. The emergency lighting flickered, and for a moment they were in complete darkness before it came back on. "Your orders don't account for structural failure," Valeria said. "These children are my responsibility, and I'm getting them to safety." She moved past the security guard, and the other adults followed her lead. Sometimes leadership means making decisions that go against conventional wisdom, trusting your expertise and judgment even when others disagree. During her academic career, she had often found herself in situations where her research conclusions contradicted conventional thinking. The ability to stand by her analysis in the face of skepticism had been essential to her success as a scientist. Now those same skills were helping her navigate a life-threatening emergency. The first-floor lobby was in chaos. The large dinosaur skeleton had toppled, its bones scattered across the marble floor. Several display cases had shattered, and museum staff was trying to manage multiple groups of visitors who were scared and confused. "Almost there, explorers," Valeria announced cheerfully. "Our cave adventure is almost over, and we'll be back outside in the sunshine soon." The children's faces showed relief as they saw natural light streaming through the lobby windows. The familiar sight of the outside world helped them understand that their ordeal was nearly over. They could see the front doors, but they were blocked by debris from fallen ceiling tiles and toppled displays. A museum employee was trying to clear a path, but it was slow going. "This way," Janet called out, pointing toward a side exit that led to the museum's loading dock. "Staff exit, it should be clear." They redirected toward the side exit, still maintaining their organized formation. As they moved through the lobby, Valeria could see the extent of the damage. This had been a significant earthquake, and the building had suffered much more damage than typical seismic events would cause. The side exit opened onto a concrete loading area behind the building. Fresh air and natural light felt like a miracle after the dark, dusty interior. But as they emerged, they could see the full scope of what had happened. Chapter 7. Outside but not safe. The scene outside the museum was like something from a disaster movie. The earthquake had lasted nearly 8 minutes, far longer than most seismic events, and the damage throughout the city was visible from where they stood. Smoke was rising from several directions, car alarms were wailing, and the sound of sirens filled the air. But Valeria's immediate concern was the children. Now that they were outside and relatively safe, the adrenaline that had kept them calm during the evacuation was wearing off. Several were beginning to cry, asking for their parents, scared by the continuing small aftershocks and the chaotic scene around them. "Circle time," she announced, using familiar daycare language to create a sense of normalcy. "Everyone sit in our circle, just like we do for story time." The children responded automatically to the routine, sitting cross-legged in a circle on the concrete. The familiar activity helped calm them, giving them something normal to focus on amid the chaos surrounding them. "We just had a really big adventure," Valeria said, sitting down with them, "and everyone was so brave and careful. Now we're safe outside, and we're going to wait here until we can go back to school." Mrs. Rodriguez was trying to use her cell phone to contact the daycare and parents, but the networks were overloaded. Emergency vehicles were beginning to arrive at the museum, and she could see that they had multiple rescue operations to coordinate. "Miss Valeria," little Tommy said, "why did the building shake like that?" This was exactly the kind of question she was equipped to answer. "Well, Tommy, the Earth is made up of big pieces called tectonic plates, kind of like a giant puzzle. Sometimes those pieces move and rub against each other, and that makes the ground shake." "Like when I rub my hands together really fast?" Sophia asked. "Exactly like that," Valeria said, smiling. "And just like when you rub your hands together, it makes energy that has to go somewhere. That energy travels through the ground and makes buildings move." Her simple, scientific explanation seemed to help the children understand what had happened without being frightened by it. Knowledge is often the best antidote to fear, and she was giving them a framework for understanding their experience. As they sat in their circle, Valeria couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. For 3 years, she had felt like a failure, someone whose career had ended in disgrace, and who was now working far below her capabilities. But in the past hour, every aspect of her background had come together in a way that had literally saved lives. Her engineering knowledge had allowed her to recognize structural failure. Her research experience had taught her to make decisions under pressure. Her years with children had given her the skills to keep them calm and organized. Emergency personnel were now arriving in larger numbers. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars filled the street. A paramedic approached their group, checking to see if anyone needed medical attention. "Any injuries here?" the paramedic asked. "No injuries," Valeria reported. 16 children, 4 adults. We evacuated from the second-floor exhibition area." The paramedic looked impressed. "You got 16 kids out of that building safely? That's incredible." The second floor sustained significant structural damage. As if to emphasize his point, they heard another crash from inside the museum, and dust clouds appeared at some of the windows. The building was continuing to fail even after the main earthquake had ended. "You made the right call evacuating when you did," the paramedic continued. "A lot of people are still trapped inside because they followed standard protocols and stayed in place." Valeria felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Her decision to trust her engineering knowledge and risk assessment had been correct, but the thought of people still trapped inside was sobering. Janet was coordinating with museum security to account for all visitors and staff. Several school groups had been in the building, along with dozens of individual visitors. The evacuation would take hours, and there were likely to be injuries. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Valeria said quietly, "we need to focus on getting these children back to their parents. They've been through a traumatic experience, and the longer we're away from the daycare, the more worried the families will be." But that presented a new problem. Their school bus had been parked in the museum's parking lot, which was now blocked by emergency vehicles. The bus driver was nowhere to be seen, and even if they could reach the bus, many of the streets between the museum and the daycare were likely blocked by earthquake damage. The radio said the main highways are closed, Mrs. Patterson reported, having found a portable radio in one of the emergency vehicles. "There are bridge inspections, building collapses, and power lines down throughout the metro area." They were safe, but they were also stranded with 16 frightened children in the middle of a major disaster. While they waited for more information, Valeria organized quiet activities to keep the children occupied. They sang songs they knew from circle time, played simple counting games, and she told them more stories about earthquakes that helped normalize their experience. "You know," she said, "earthquakes happen all over the world, and people have learned how to stay safe during them. What we did today, staying calm, helping each other, following directions, That's exactly what people are supposed to do. Emma raised her hand. Will there be more shaking? There might be some little shakes called aftershocks, Valeria explained, but they're much smaller than what we felt in the museum. And we're outside now, so we're safe. Her calm explanations and positive reframing helped maintain the children's emotional stability. Several parents had asked her over the years how she stayed so patient with difficult children, and she always explained that most difficult behavior came from fear or confusion. Address the underlying emotion, and the behavior usually improved. Chapter 8. Problem Solving. Valeria looked around at their situation and began applying the same systematic problem-solving approach she had once used for complex research challenges. She identified the key variables: location, transportation, communication, child welfare, and parent contact. Let's think through this step by step, she said to the other adults. Our primary goal is reuniting these children with their families. Our secondary goal is keeping them safe and calm until we can make that happen. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag, the same type she had always used for laboratory observations, and began making lists. Even in crisis situations, organized thinking was essential. First, communication. Mrs. Rodriguez, keep trying the daycare on your phone every few minutes. Networks might clear up periodically. Mrs. Patterson, see if any of these emergency workers have a radio we can use to contact the daycare or police dispatch. Second, transportation. We need to find out which routes are open. Maybe we can't get the bus out, but there might be other options. Third, immediate needs. These children are going to be hungry soon, and some of them are probably getting tired. Janet, does the museum have any emergency supplies we could access?
Janet nodded. There's an emergency kit in the staff office. Bottled water, some snacks, basic first aid supplies. I can try to get back inside to retrieve it. No, Valeria said firmly. The building is still unstable. We don't risk any adults going back inside, but that's good information to have. She was thinking like a project manager again, breaking down complex challenges into manageable components. It felt natural and right, using skills she hadn't exercised in years. A fire department captain approached their group, clipboard in hand. I'm Captain Morrison, he said. We're trying to coordinate evacuation of all the school groups. How many children do you have? 16 four-year-olds from Sunshine Daycare, Valeria replied. We need to get them back to their families, but our transportation is blocked and some roads are closed. Captain Morrison consulted his notes. Sunshine Daycare. That's about 12 miles from here, right? We've got reports of significant damage along that route. Bridge inspections will keep the main roads closed for at least another 2 hours. What about alternative routes? Valeria asked. We're setting up temporary shelters for displaced people, the captain said, but we're prioritizing getting children back to their families. Let me see what I can arrange. While they waited, Valeria organized activities to keep the children occupied and calm. They sang songs, played simple games that could be done sitting in their circle, and she told them stories about earthquakes that made the experience seem less frightening. A long, long time ago, she began, people thought earthquakes were caused by a giant catfish that lived underground. When the catfish wiggled, the earth would shake. The children giggled at this image, and she continued with other cultural explanations for earthquakes from around the world. It was both educational and comforting, giving them a sense that humans had always dealt with these natural events. In Japan, they thought a giant namazu fish caused earthquakes. In some places in Africa, people believed it was a giant frog jumping. And in ancient Greece, they thought the god Poseidon was hitting the ground with his trident. Little Marcus seemed particularly interested in these stories. Were the people scared like us? I think they probably were, Valeria said honestly. But they found ways to understand what was happening and take care of each other, just like we're doing today. After about an hour, Captain Morrison returned with news. I've arranged for a police transport van to take your group back to the daycare. The officer knows alternative routes that should be passable. You'll need to be ready to go in about 20 minutes. That's wonderful, Mrs. Rodriguez said, relief evident in her voice. But Valeria was still thinking ahead. Captain, what's the situation at the daycare? Are the families being notified about our delay? The daycare has been contacted, he confirmed. They're setting up a family reunification area. Parents are being notified, but obviously everyone is dealing with earthquake response, so communications are challenging. As they prepared to leave, Valeria took one last look at the museum building. What had started as an educational field trip had become a life-changing experience. She had discovered something about herself that she had forgotten: her ability to lead, to make critical decisions under pressure, to use her knowledge and skills to protect others. More importantly, she had found purpose again. The earthquake had done more than shake the building. It had shaken loose her assumptions about her own worth and capabilities. For 3 years, she had defined herself by her professional failure, by what had been taken from her. But today had shown her what remained: expertise, judgment, leadership ability, and the capacity to serve others in their moment of greatest need.
The police transport van was designed for transporting multiple people safely, with bench seating and safety restraints. Getting 16 excited and tired 4-year-olds properly secured took some time, but the officer was patient and helpful. "You folks did an amazing job getting those kids out safely," the officer, Sergeant Martinez, told Valeria as they prepared to depart. "I've been getting reports from the museum all afternoon. Sounds like you made some pretty smart decisions in there." The drive back to the daycare took nearly an hour, much longer than the usual 20-minute trip. They had to take surface streets and detour around several areas where buildings had sustained damage or power lines were down. The children pressed their faces to the windows, pointing at the unfamiliar sights. "Look, the street is all cracked," Emma observed. "And that building has a big hole in it," Tommy added. Valeria used the opportunity to explain what they were seeing. "Remember how I told you the Earth's puzzle pieces moved? Well, when they move, they can crack streets and damage buildings. That's why we had to leave the museum, to make sure everyone stayed safe." "Are our houses okay?" Sophia asked, voicing the concern that several children were obviously thinking about. "Most buildings are built to be very strong," Valeria reassured them. "And if there was any damage to your houses, your parents and other grown-ups would make sure you have a safe place to stay." During the long drive, she found herself thinking about her sister Maria's words from 3 years ago. "Children don't care about your past. They just need someone who will care about them." Maria had been right, but it was more complicated than that. The children didn't care about her past failures, but they had benefited enormously from her past achievements. Her scientific training, her research experience, her leadership skills, all of it had come together to serve them when they needed it most. When they finally arrived at Sunshine Daycare, the scene was organized chaos. Parents had been called and were arriving to pick up their children, but the daycare staff was also dealing with minor earthquake damage to their own building and trying to coordinate with families throughout the area. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately went to speak with the daycare director, Mrs. Chen, while Mrs. Patterson began helping children gather their belongings. Valeria found herself naturally taking charge of the reunification process, checking children out to their parents, and providing brief explanations of their experience. "Miss Valeria kept us really safe," little Marcus told his mother. "She taught us about the Earth puzzle pieces, and we were brave explorers in the dark cave." The first few parents were emotional, hugging their children tightly and thanking the daycare staff repeatedly. But as more families arrived, Valeria noticed that word was spreading about their experience at the museum. "I heard you had to evacuate the building," one mother said to Valeria. "That must have been terrifying." "The children were remarkably brave," Valeria replied. "We turned it into an adventure, and everyone followed instructions perfectly. But she could see that some parents wanted more details about what had happened and how decisions had been made. A few looked concerned about whether proper protocols had been followed. One father, a man named Robert Chen, whose daughter Lucy was in their group, approached Valeria with obvious gratitude, but also curiosity. "Lucy told me you knew about buildings and earthquakes. She said you taught them about the earth moving like puzzle pieces." "I have some engineering background," Valeria said carefully. "It helped me understand what was happening in the building." "My wife is a structural engineer," Robert said. "When I told her about the evacuation, she said most people would have followed standard protocols and stayed in place. She thinks you probably saved lives by getting everyone out when you did." This kind of validation from a professional peer meant more to Valeria than she wanted to admit. For 3 years, she had doubted her own judgment, wondered if her scientific training was still relevant, questioned whether she had anything valuable to offer. Today had proven that her knowledge and skills were not only relevant, but potentially life-saving. Mrs. Chen approached Valeria as the last few children were being picked up. "Could we talk privately for a moment?" They stepped into the office, where Mrs. Chen closed the door and sat down across from Valeria. Her expression was serious, but not unfriendly. "I've been getting calls from parents about what happened at the museum," Mrs. Chen began. "Some are concerned about the decision to evacuate during the earthquake. Others are praising the way you handled the situation. I need to understand exactly what happened." Valeria took a deep breath. She had been expecting this conversation, knowing that any deviation from standard emergency protocols would need to be explained and justified. "The building was showing clear signs of structural compromise," she said. "Ceiling cracks, falling debris, sounds of metal stress. Based on my engineering background, I assessed that staying in place would be more dangerous than evacuating." Mrs. Chen leaned forward slightly. Engineering background? This was the moment Valeria had been dreading for 3 years, the moment when her past would either help or hurt her current position. She made a decision to be completely honest. "I have a PhD in biomedical engineering," she said quietly. "I was a professor at Stanford for 8 years before some personal and professional difficulties led me to change careers." "Why didn't you put that on your application?" "Because I was afraid it would make me seem overqualified, like I was just passing through until something better came along. But the truth is, this job has become important to me. These children are important to me." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "So when you made the decision to evacuate, you were drawing on actual structural engineering knowledge?" "Yes. The signs of building failure were clear to me in a way they might not have been to someone without that background. I weighed the risks and made a judgment call." "And that judgment call likely saved lives," Mrs. Chen said slowly. "I've been getting updates from the fire department. The second floor of the museum suffered a partial ceiling collapse about 20 minutes after you evacuated. If you had followed standard protocols and sheltered in place." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood the implications. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" Valeria asked. "Yeah." Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "Valeria, you're getting a commendation. The mayor's office has already called asking for details about our heroic daycare worker. The local news wants to interview you. And frankly, I want to talk about expanding your role here." Chapter 10. Recognition and Reflection. The media attention was overwhelming and uncomfortable. Valeria had spent 3 years trying to remain invisible, avoiding any situation that might bring her past into public view. Now she found herself thrust into the spotlight as the daycare teacher who saved 16 children during the earthquake. The local news station wanted to interview her on the evening broadcast. The newspaper wanted to do a feature story. Parents from the daycare were calling her a hero. But the attention felt complicated and bittersweet. "I just used common sense," she told the reporter, who managed to track her down at her apartment. Any parent would have done the same thing to protect children. But you have a technical background that helped you assess the situation, don't you? The reporter pressed. Valeria hesitated. I have some engineering training, yes. But the important thing is that all the children are safe. She declined most interview requests, but the story took on a life of its own. Social media picked up the tale of the mystery daycare hero, who had expertise she wasn't talking about. Some versions of the story were accurate, others were wildly embellished. The earthquake had been a magnitude 6.8, significant enough to cause substantial damage throughout the metropolitan area. The museum where they had been trapped was one of dozens of buildings that sustained major structural damage. The death toll could have been much higher if not for the quick thinking of first responders and, in a few cases, civilians who made critical decisions under pressure. Within a week, she received a phone call that changed everything. Dr. Chen, this is Dr. Patricia Williams from the University of California, San Francisco. I was hoping we could meet to discuss a research opportunity. Valeria's hands trembled as she held the phone. I think you may have me confused with someone else. I work at a daycare. Dr. Chen, I know exactly who you are. I've followed your work for years, and I was deeply disappointed when you left academia. The earthquake story made me realize you're still in the area, and I'd like to offer you a position. The meeting took place at a coffee shop near UCSF, neutral territory where Valeria felt less intimidated. Dr. Williams was a respected researcher in pediatric medicine, someone whose work Valeria had admired from afar. I'm developing a new research program focused on emergency pediatric care, Doctor, Williams explained. We're looking at how children respond to trauma, how to improve emergency protocols for schools and daycares, how to design buildings and systems that better protect young people during disasters. She paused, studying Valeria's face. Your background in biomedical engineering, combined with your recent practical experience with children in crisis, makes you uniquely qualified for this work. Plus, from everything I've heard, you have natural leadership abilities and excellent judgment under pressure. Valeria stared into her coffee cup. Dr. Williams, I appreciate the offer, but I think you should know about my history at Stanford. There were accusations, investigations. I know about Marcus Wolf. Doctor, Williams said quietly. I also know that several people in the scientific community have suspected for years that he built his career on your foundational work. His recent research has been derivative, lacking the innovative thinking that characterized your early publications. This was news to Valeria. She had deliberately avoided following developments in her former field, finding it too painful to watch Marcus's continued success. The scientific community has a long memory, Doctor, Williams continued, and many of us have been waiting for you to return. This earthquake incident has reminded people that you're still here, still capable of brilliant work. But I haven't done research in over 3 years. My knowledge is outdated, my skills are rusty. Your instincts are clearly intact, Doctor. Williams smiled. You assessed a complex emergency situation, made rapid decisions based on technical knowledge, and led a successful operation under extreme pressure. Those are exactly the skills we need for this research program. The offer was tempting, but Valeria found herself thinking about the children at Sunshine Daycare. Emma with her elaborate block constructions, Tommy with his endless energy, Sophia with her quiet empathy. They had accepted her completely, trusted her absolutely, needed her in ways that felt meaningful and important. I need some time to think about this, she said. Of course. But Valeria, you should know that this work would directly benefit children like the ones you protected last week. We're not just doing abstract research. We're trying to save lives. Over the next few days, Valeria found herself at a crossroads that felt both familiar and entirely new. 3 years ago, when her academic career had imploded, she had felt like she was falling into an abyss. Now she was being offered a chance to climb back up, but she wasn't sure she wanted to return to the world that had rejected her. The children at the daycare had taught her things about herself that she had never learned in graduate school or the research laboratory: patience, empathy, the ability to find joy in small moments, the satisfaction of nurturing growth rather than just pursuing discovery. These weren't lesser skills. They were different skills, and they had value.
But Dr. Williams was right about the potential impact of the research. Emergency preparedness for children was a field that desperately needed the kind of interdisciplinary approach that combined engineering, psychology, and practical experience. She could make a difference on a much larger scale than just the 16 children in her daycare group. Valeria spent the next few days in deep reflection. She walked through her neighborhood, sat in parks, and thought about the direction her life had taken. The earthquake had been a catalyst, forcing her to confront questions she had been avoiding for years. Who was she, really? The disgraced professor who had been driven from academia by false accusations? The dedicated daycare worker who had found purpose in caring for young children? The emergency leader who had saved lives through quick thinking and technical expertise? Perhaps she was all of these things, and perhaps that was exactly what made her valuable.
She thought about Marcus and the anger she had carried for so long, the fury at his betrayal, the bitterness over stolen credit, the humiliation of public disgrace. Those feelings had defined her for years, but they no longer seemed as important as they once had. The children at the daycare didn't care about her past professional achievements or failures. They cared that she listened to their stories, helped them with their shoes, and kept them safe when the ground shook beneath their feet. That was a different kind of success, but it was no less meaningful. On Friday afternoon, she made her decision. "Mrs. Chen," she said, finding the director in her office. "I have a proposition for you." She explained Dr. Williams's offer and her own conflicted feelings about returning to academic research.
"What I'd like to propose is a part-time arrangement," Valeria said. "I could work at UCSF 3 days a week on the emergency pediatric care research and continue here 2 days a week. The research would directly benefit children like ours, and I could bring what I learned back to improve our own emergency preparedness." Mrs. Chen looked intrigued. "That's an interesting idea, but would the university accept a part-time arrangement?" "I haven't asked yet. But I think Dr. Williams wants my expertise badly enough to be flexible, and honestly, I think I need both parts of this equation. The research work feeds my intellectual needs, but these children feed my soul." The conversation with Dr. Williams went better than expected. "Actually, that sounds ideal," she said when Valeria explained her proposal. "We want someone who maintains regular contact with children and childcare providers. Your ongoing work at the daycare would enhance your research credibility, not diminish it." The arrangement was formalized within 2 weeks. Dr. Valeria Chen would join UCSF as a senior research scientist, working Monday through Wednesday on emergency pediatric protocols. Thursday and Friday, she would continue as an educational specialist at Sunshine Daycare, now with an expanded role in emergency preparedness and STEM education. The transition back to academic work was both exhilarating and challenging. The university environment felt familiar, yet foreign after 3 years away. She had to relearn research methodologies, catch up on advances in her field, and adapt to new technologies and procedures. But she also brought something unique to the research team: real-world experience with children in crisis situations. While her colleagues could theorize about child psychology and emergency response, she had actually implemented evacuation procedures with frightened 4-year-olds. That practical knowledge informed every aspect of their research design. Her first project involved developing new guidelines for earthquake preparedness in educational settings. She interviewed teachers, administrators, and emergency responders, but she also spent time observing children at play, understanding their developmental capabilities and limitations. Most emergency protocols are written by adults for adults, she explained to her research team. We need to think about how a 4-year-old processes information, what kind of instructions they can follow, what will calm them versus what will frighten them. 6 months later, Valeria presented her preliminary research findings at the National Conference on Pediatric Emergency Medicine. The auditorium was packed with doctors, researchers, and emergency responders from around the country. Traditional earthquake protocols for schools and daycares assume that buildings will remain structurally sound during seismic events, she began, her voice steady and confident. However, our analysis of recent earthquakes suggests that this assumption may be dangerous, particularly for older buildings and those with large, open spaces like gymnasiums and cafeterias. The presentation went on to outline new protocols for rapid structural assessment, decision-making frameworks for evacuation versus shelter in place, and training programs for childcare workers. It was groundbreaking work that combined engineering principles, child psychology, and practical emergency management. Standing at the podium, presenting to an audience of her professional peers, Valeria felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about returning to academia. It was about using every aspect of her experience and training in service of something larger than herself. During the question and answer session, a familiar voice spoke from the back of the auditorium. Dr. Chen, this research methodology is remarkably similar to work I published 3 years ago on emergency medical protocols. I'm wondering if you've built on that foundation? Valeria looked up to see Marcus Wolf standing in the back row. He was older now, grayer, and something in his expression suggested this wasn't a friendly professional inquiry. The room fell silent, sensing tension. Several audience members looked uncomfortable, and Valeria could see colleagues who knew their history watching carefully. She took a breath, drawing on the same calm she had summoned in the museum stairwell. Dr. Wolf, I'm familiar with your recent publications, she said evenly. While there may be some superficial similarities in our approaches, this research is based on entirely different foundational principles. My work focuses on structural engineering assessment and child psychology, areas that weren't addressed in your emergency medical protocols. She paused, looking directly at him. However, if you'd like to discuss potential collaboration opportunities, I'd be happy to speak with you after the presentation. It was a masterful response that acknowledged his presence without conceding any ground, offered professional courtesy without admitting any debt, and redirected attention back to the scientific merits of her work. Marcus sat down without further comment, and the presentation continued. Several audience members approached Valeria afterward to discuss implementation of her protocols in their own institutions. No one mentioned Marcus's interruption, but as the crowd dispersed, she noticed him waiting near the exit. Valeria, he said quietly as she approached, could we talk privately? They found a quiet corner of the conference center lobby. Marcus looked uncomfortable, older than his years, lacking the confident arrogance she remembered. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. What I did at Stanford was wrong. I was afraid of being overshadowed by your work, afraid of never getting the recognition I thought I deserved, so I sabotaged you. Valeria waited silently, feeling surprisingly calm. The anger she had carried for so long seemed to have evaporated somewhere between the museum evacuation and this moment. I've spent 3 years building a career on the foundation you created, Marcus continued, and it's been hollow. Every award, every recognition, every opportunity has felt fraudulent because I knew the truth. Why are you telling me this now? Valeria asked. Because seeing you here, doing work that actually matters, made me realize what I've become. And because I heard about what you did during the earthquake. You used your scientific knowledge to save children's lives. I used mine to destroy a colleague's career. Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. These are copies of all our original research notes from the gene therapy project. Your handwriting, your calculations, your breakthrough insights. I've also written a detailed statement acknowledging that the foundational work was yours. I'm submitting it to the Stanford Ethics Committee, the NIH, and the journals that published my papers. Valeria stared at the folder. Marcus, why now? You could have done this years ago. Because I was a coward then. I was more concerned with protecting my reputation than doing what was right. But watching you rebuild your life, seeing the impact you're having now, I realized that integrity delayed is integrity denied. She took the folder, feeling its weight. Inside were documents that could restore her professional reputation, vindicate her years of struggle, perhaps even lead to formal recognition of her contributions to the gene therapy research. Thank you, she said simply. Marcus nodded. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that the truth will finally be told. As he walked away, Valeria reflected on how much had changed. 3 years ago, this vindication would have meant everything to her. Now it felt important, but not essential. She had already rebuilt her life, found new purpose, discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed.
The formal vindication process took several months, but it proceeded smoothly once Marcus's documentation was submitted. Stanford University issued a formal apology and offered to restore her position. The NIH reviewed the gene therapy research and officially credited her as the lead investigator. Several scientific journals published corrections acknowledging her contributions. The media coverage was intense but positive. Vindicated scientist returns to prominence after heroic earthquake rescue was typical of the headlines. Profile articles described her journey from academic disgrace to daycare heroism to research renaissance. But for Valeria, the most meaningful recognition came from the children at Sunshine Daycare. Miss Valeria, are you going to be famous now? Little Emma asked one Thursday morning as they worked on a science experiment involving plant growth and different types of soil. I don't know about famous, Valeria replied, helping Emma measure water for her plant, but I'm definitely happy. I get to work with amazing children like you, and I also get to do research that might help keep other children safe. Will you still come play with us? Tommy asked, looking worried. Every Thursday and Friday, Valeria promised. This is where I belong too. The hybrid arrangement was working beautifully. Her research at UCSF was breaking new ground in emergency preparedness for children, and her continued work at the daycare kept her grounded in the practical realities of childcare. She was publishing papers, speaking at conferences, and consulting with school districts around the country. But she was also reading stories, tying shoes, and wiping tears. She was both Dr. Chen, respected researcher, and Miss Valeria, beloved teacher. On a warm spring afternoon, she received a call from Dr. Williams. Valeria, I have interesting news. The MacArthur Foundation is considering you for one of their fellowships. They're particularly interested in your work bridging academic research and practical application. The MacArthur Fellowship, often called the Genius Grant, was one of the most prestigious awards in academic and scientific fields. Recipients received a substantial financial award and the freedom to pursue innovative work. That's incredible, Valeria said, though she felt strangely calm about the news. But I hope they understand that I won't be changing my current arrangement. The daycare work is integral to my research. Actually, that's exactly what interests them. They're looking for people who are doing innovative work outside traditional academic structures. A year earlier, the possibility of such recognition would have seemed like an impossible dream. Now it felt like natural recognition of work that was important regardless of awards.
The MacArthur Fellowship notification came on a Tuesday morning while she was at the daycare, helping the children with their morning activities. Mrs. Chen called her into the office to take the call, and she emerged to find 16 four-year-olds waiting impatiently for their science experiment. "What took so long, Miss Valeria?" Sophia asked. "I was talking to some people about our volcano experiments," Valeria said, which was true in a way. The MacArthur Foundation had been particularly interested in her work developing hands-on science activities that could also teach emergency preparedness skills. "Are we going to make bigger volcanoes?" Tommy wanted to know. "Maybe," Valeria said, laughing. "We'll see what happens."
As her reputation grew, Valeria began receiving invitations to train other childcare providers and teachers in emergency preparedness. Her protocols were being adopted by school districts, and she was asked to develop training materials for a national rollout. One of her most rewarding projects was creating a training program for daycare workers that combined practical emergency skills with basic scientific literacy. She wanted other caregivers to feel confident making the kind of rapid assessments that had guided her decisions during the earthquake. "You don't need a PhD to understand structural stress," she told a group of 50 daycare workers during a training session. "You just need to know what to look for and trust your observations." She taught them to recognize signs of building compromise, to assess evacuation routes, to make quick decisions under pressure. But more importantly, she taught them to trust their professional judgment and act decisively when children's safety was at stake. "Most of you have been working with children for years," she said. "You already know how to stay calm in chaotic situations, how to manage groups under stress, how to make children feel safe when they're scared. These are exactly the skills you need for emergency situations." The feedback from these training sessions was overwhelmingly positive. Teachers reported feeling more confident and prepared. Several credited the training with helping them handle actual emergencies more effectively. One particularly gratifying letter came from a kindergarten teacher in Oregon. "Dr. Chen, I wanted you to know that your training helped me save my class during a wildfire evacuation last month. I noticed smoke damage to our usual evacuation route and trusted my judgment to take an alternative path. We all got out safely, and the fire department later confirmed that our usual route had been compromised. Thank you for teaching me to trust my observations and act decisively." These stories reminded Valeria why her work mattered. It wasn't about academic prestige or professional recognition. It was about empowering people to protect children, giving them tools and confidence to act when it mattered most. Her training programs expanded to include not just emergency preparedness, but also basic STEM education for early childhood educators. She developed simple experiments and activities that could teach scientific thinking while also being fun and engaging for young children.
"Science isn't just about memorizing facts," she would tell teachers. "It's about asking questions, making observations, and figuring out how things work." Every four-year-old is already a scientist. They just need adults who support their curiosity. The integrated approach of combining emergency preparedness with science education proved to be particularly effective. Children who understood basic concepts about earthquakes, weather, and building structures were better able to stay calm during actual emergencies. And teachers who were comfortable explaining scientific concepts were more confident in their ability to assess and respond to crisis situations. 5 years after the earthquake, Valeria was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for Stanford University's School of Engineering. The invitation was both an honor and a symbol of how completely her professional rehabilitation had been accomplished.
Standing at the podium where she had once presented research findings as a young professor, she looked out at hundreds of graduates and their families. These young engineers would go on to design buildings, develop technologies, and solve problems that could affect millions of lives. "When I was a student here 25 years ago," she began, "I thought success meant making groundbreaking discoveries, publishing influential papers, and earning professional recognition. Those things are important, but I've learned that the most meaningful success comes from using your knowledge and skills to serve others." She told them about her journey, the rise and fall of her academic career, the years of rebuilding at the daycare, the earthquake that changed everything, and the new path that combined research with direct service. "I want to challenge you to think beyond traditional career paths," she said. "The world needs engineers who work in schools, scientists who serve in community organizations, researchers who stay connected to the practical applications of their work." She paused, looking around the familiar auditorium. Excellence isn't just about being the smartest person in the room. It's about using your intelligence and expertise to make other people's lives better. Sometimes that means developing new technologies. Sometimes it means teaching children. Sometimes it means making split-second decisions that save lives. After the ceremony, several graduates approached her with questions about alternative career paths, ways to combine technical expertise with social service, opportunities to make a direct impact on communities. One young woman, fresh from completing her biomedical engineering degree, was particularly interested in Valeria's work. "Dr. Chen, I've been following your research on emergency protocols for schools. I'm wondering if there are opportunities to work in that field right out of college." Valeria smiled, remembering her own eagerness as a new graduate. "What interests you about this work?" "I have 2 younger siblings, and I keep thinking about how vulnerable children are during disasters. I want to use my engineering background to make them safer." "That's exactly the right motivation," Valeria said. "Let me give you my card." We're always looking for people who understand both the technical and human sides of emergency preparedness. As she drove home from the ceremony, Valeria reflected on how much her definition of success had evolved. Academic honors and professional recognition were gratifying, but they weren't what gave her life meaning.
That meaning came from the children at Sunshine Daycare who trusted her completely, from the teachers she trained who felt more confident protecting their students, from the protocols she developed that were being used to keep children safe around the world. The earthquake had been a turning point, but not just because it allowed her to demonstrate her capabilities. It had forced her to integrate all aspects of herself, the scientist, the teacher, the leader, the caregiver, into something greater than the sum of its parts. 7 years after the earthquake, Valeria's research program had grown into a nationally recognized center for emergency preparedness in educational settings. The Chen Center for Child Safety, as it had been named, brought together researchers from multiple disciplines to study how children respond to crises and how adults can better protect them.
But despite her growing prominence in academic circles, Valeria never forgot where her real insights came from. Every Thursday and Friday, she could still be found at Sunshine Daycare, reading stories to 4-year-olds and helping them discover the wonders of science. The children who had been with her during the earthquake were now 11 years old, in middle school, and some still kept in touch. Emma had developed a passion for architecture and talked about designing earthquake-resistant buildings. Tommy was fascinated by seismology and wanted to study the science of earthquakes. Sophia had become interested in emergency medicine, inspired by the paramedic she had met that day. "You planted seeds that day," Mrs. Chen told Valeria during one of their regular check-ins, "not just in keeping them safe, but in showing them how knowledge and courage can be used to help others." The daycare itself had become something of a model for emergency preparedness. Valeria had worked with the staff to develop protocols that other facilities around the country were now adopting. They conducted regular drills that felt like games to the children, but taught real safety skills. They had redesigned the physical space to eliminate potential hazards and improve evacuation routes. "We've created a culture of safety that doesn't feel scary," Mrs. Rodriguez, now the assistant director, observed. "The children learn to be prepared without being anxious." This philosophy, preparedness without anxiety, had become central to Valeria's research and training programs. She had discovered that children could learn important safety skills through play and exploration, without developing the fear and trauma that sometimes resulted from traditional emergency drills.
One of her most successful innovations was the Safety Scientists program, where children learned about natural disasters through hands-on experiments and activities. They built model buildings to test earthquake resistance, created weather stations to understand storm systems, and practiced emergency procedures through role-playing games. When children understand how something works, they're less afraid of it, Valeria explained to a group of educators. And when they feel like they have some control over their response, they're more likely to stay calm during an actual emergency. The program had been implemented in over 200 schools and daycares across the country, with remarkable results. Children who participated in safety scientists showed significantly less anxiety during emergency drills and demonstrated better compliance with safety procedures.
10 years after the earthquake, Valeria received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days at the daycare. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, asked her to keynote their World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Education. The conference brought together educators, emergency managers, and policymakers from around the world to share strategies for protecting children during natural disasters. Valeria's presentation, From the Ground Up, Building Resilience in Young Learners, was attended by delegates from over 80 countries. Disaster preparedness is not just about having the right procedures, she told the international audience. It's about creating cultures of knowledge, curiosity, and mutual care that enable people to respond effectively when crisis strikes. She shared stories from her research, examples from schools around the world, and practical strategies that could be adapted to different cultural contexts. But she also talked about her personal journey and the lessons she had learned about resilience, purpose, and the power of serving others. 12 years ago, I thought my career was over, she said. I had lost my position, my reputation, and my sense of identity. But sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning. Sometimes we have to lose who we thought we were to discover who we're meant to be. The response was overwhelming. Delegates lined up after her presentation to discuss implementing her programs in their own countries. Several governments invited her to consult on national emergency preparedness policies. The European Union requested a detailed proposal for continent-wide safety education initiatives, but the moment that meant the most to her came during the conference's closing ceremony. A teacher from Bangladesh approached her with tears in her eyes. Dr. Chen, the woman said, I implemented your safety scientist program in my school last year. 2 months ago, we had a major flood. My students, some as young as 6, helped evacuate younger children and elderly neighbors. They stayed calm, followed procedures, and likely saved lives. Thank you for giving them the tools they needed. These were the stories that reminded Valeria why her work mattered. Not the academic recognition or professional accolades, but the real impact on real children in real communities around the world. 15 years after the earthquake, Valeria stood once again in the lobby of the Natural History Museum. The building had been completely renovated after the seismic damage, with new construction standards and state-of-the-art safety systems. A small plaque near the entrance commemorated the earthquake and the heroic actions of museum staff and visitors, who had helped evacuate the building safely. She was there for the opening of a new exhibition, Prepared and Protected: Science Education for Safety. The exhibition featured interactive displays based on her research, hands-on activities from the Safety Scientists program, and real stories from children around the world who had used scientific knowledge to stay safe during emergencies. Emma, now 26 and a practicing architect, had helped design the exhibition space. Tommy, pursuing his PhD in seismology, had contributed to the earthquake simulation display. Sophia, working as a pediatric nurse, had advised on the sections about children's psychological responses to trauma. It's amazing to think it all started here, Emma said as they walked through the completed exhibition, in this same building where we were so scared. You weren't just scared, Valeria corrected gently. You were brave. All of you. You followed instructions, helped each other, and trusted the adults to keep you safe. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. The exhibition opening was attended by educators, emergency responders, and families from around the region. Children moved through the displays with excitement and curiosity, learning about natural disasters through games and experiments that made complex concepts accessible and engaging. But for Valeria, the most meaningful moment came when she saw a group of current Sunshine Daycare students exploring the exhibition with their teachers. They were the same age she and her group had been 15 years ago, full of wonder and energy, eager to understand how the world worked. "Miss Valeria," one of them called out, recognizing her from her weekly visits to the daycare, "is this your museum?" "It's everyone's museum," she replied, kneeling down to their level. "But yes, I helped create some of these activities. What do you think?" "I want to be a safety scientist too," the little boy announced. "I want to help keep people safe." As she watched the children engage with the exhibits, learning and playing and discovering, Valeria felt a deep sense of completion. The circle that had begun with terror and confusion in this very building had closed with purpose and hope. 20 years after the earthquake, Dr. Valeria Chen was invited to deliver the commencement address at Stanford University. Standing at the podium in the same institution where her career had once ended in disgrace, she looked out at hundreds of graduates ready to begin their own journeys. 25 years ago, I stood in this very building as a new professor, convinced that success meant individual achievement and professional recognition, she began. I was brilliant, ambitious, and completely wrong about what mattered most. She told them her story without bitterness or self-pity, simply as an example of how life can take unexpected turns and how those turns can lead to unexpected gifts. The earthquake that changed my life taught me that expertise without compassion is hollow, that knowledge without service is incomplete, and that the highest calling of any scientist is to use their understanding to protect and serve others. She challenged the graduates to think beyond traditional definitions of success, to find ways to integrate their technical skills with human needs, to remember that the ultimate purpose of knowledge is to improve life for all people. "You are the most educated generation in human history," she said. "You have access to tools and information that previous generations could never have imagined. The question is not what you can achieve, but what you can contribute. Not what you can discover, but what you can protect. Not what you can build, but what you can nurture." After the ceremony, a young graduate student in biomedical engineering approached her. "Dr. Chen," she said, "I've been following your research since high school. I was one of the children in the Safety Scientists program. It inspired me to pursue engineering, and now I want to work on medical devices for disaster response."
These moments of connection and continuity reminded Valeria that impact is measured not just in immediate results, but in the generations of people who are inspired to carry the work forward. 25 years after the earthquake, Valeria received a letter that made her cry happy tears. "Dear Doctor Chen," it read, "My name is Emma Rodriguez. You might remember me from Sunshine Daycare. I was one of the children you kept safe during the big earthquake when I was 4 years old." Emma was now 31, a successful architect who specialized in designing earthquake-resistant schools and community centers. She had married and had 2 young children of her own. "I've been reading about your work in emergency preparedness, and I realized that you're the Miss Valeria who taught us about science experiments and kept us calm when the building was shaking. I wanted you to know that you inspired me to want to help keep people safe too." The letter went on to describe Emma's current work designing safer schools in earthquake-prone regions, her volunteer work with disaster relief organizations, and her efforts to incorporate safety education into architectural planning. "I hope someday I can make the kind of difference in people's lives that you made in mine. Thank you for showing me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you are scared. I'm bringing my children to visit the museum exhibition next month. I want to show them where it all started, where I learned that science and caring can work together to keep people safe. Valeria read the letter 3 times before sharing it with her colleagues at UCSF and the staff at Sunshine Daycare. It represented everything she had hoped to accomplish, inspiring the next generation to use their knowledge and skills in service of others. That afternoon, she was working with a new group of 4-year-olds at the daycare, helping them build structures with blocks and explaining why some designs were more stable than others. Miss Valeria, one little boy asked, "How do you know so much about buildings?" "Well," she said, sitting down on the floor with them, "I used to study how to make buildings very strong and safe. And then I learned that the most important thing isn't just knowing about buildings, it's using that knowledge to help people." "Will you teach us to make safe buildings too?" a little girl asked. "Absolutely," Valeria smiled. "We'll start with blocks, and who knows? Maybe someday you'll design real buildings that keep families safe." As she watched the children work, carefully placing one block on top of another, testing stability and rebuilding when structures fell, she thought about the earthquake that had changed her life. In that moment of crisis, she had discovered who she really was. Not just a scientist or a teacher or a leader, but someone who could combine all of those roles in service of protecting others. The children didn't know they were learning from someone who had been featured on magazine covers, invited to the White House, or honored with prestigious awards. They just knew Miss Valeria, who made science fun, kept them safe, and believed in their ability to build amazing things. And that, Valeria thought, as she helped steady a particularly ambitious block tower, was exactly how it should be. The earthquake had shaken more than just the ground that day. It had shaken loose her old assumptions about success, forced her to rebuild her sense of purpose, and revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed. The disaster had become the catalyst for the most meaningful work of her life. Sometimes the things that break us open are exactly what we need to discover who we're truly meant to be. In the end, Doctor. Valeria Chen had found something more valuable than professional vindication or academic honors. She had found a way to be completely herself, scientist and caregiver, researcher and teacher, leader and servant. She had found work that used every part of her intelligence and experience in service of the people who mattered most. She had found her second chance, and she had made it count. Like the children building with blocks around her, she had learned that the most important structures are built one careful piece at a time, with patience, wisdom, and love. And like the seeds planted in a teacher's garden, the impact of that work would continue growing long after she was gone, carried forward by students who became teachers, children who became protectors, and young minds that learned to see science not as abstract knowledge, but as a tool for caring for one another. The earthquake had lasted 8 minutes. Its impact would last generations. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.